Hi Simon, thank you for being here and having this conversation. I would like to start mentioning how your research and your work has addressed the ideological construction of work, as you mentioned in the interview with Alejandro Labastida. I mean, this classical idea of how the division of time in 8 hours work, 8 hours sleep, and 8 hours leisure, a division that has been disappearing over last decades and something that you have been questioning in some of your projects. In this sense, the lockdown, for those of us who have been able to work from home, has revealed in a way the imbalance of our lives and how we have been delegating care, for instance, and in order to have this homogeneity and productivity demanded by capitalism. We are currently becoming more aware of this new sense of diffuse and ambiguous time and how mixed work and personal spaces and times are. With this in mind, could you tell us more about your idea of time? I mean, in your piece, you developed this sense of stop time, and this waiting time makes an interesting counterpoint to the outdoor lives represented in the street. For instance, the read and the time is emphasized in the final lesson with this action of the cat, this repetition displayed in this action, and how the cat acts mechanically and automatons looking outwards, maybe in asking for help or giving greetings to the wall. Can you develop more this idea of time linked with your research of work? Thank you.
Hi Virginia, thanks for your questions. And I think when I got back I was really jet lagged, and somehow the first few weeks of the lockdown really felt like I was jet lagged all the time, like time had collapsed. And I think the results of this are quite layered. When I moved into this apartment a few years ago, I started working on a film called Without Light, and in that film, which is kind of a precursor to this one, I was thinking about how Johannesburg is defined by a workday rhythm, by rhythms of day and night, but also how work increasingly invades our space of home, of our free time, of that 8 hours for what we will. And it was, in a lot of ways, it was kind of thinking about the light of screens, of our computers, of our phones, artificial light, how that allows work to enter into the space of the home, but also how work invades more, it invades our sense of self, our identity, and it bleeds into our sense of value. In that way, the collapse of time is not really new, but I think the lockdown conditions have really brought it to breaking point, and we need to think about what constitutes work and what's been excluded. I think this is sort of very present and urgent at the moment. Thinking with the work-day structure, with this 8-hour structure, has been a way to kind of question the invasion of work into the 8 hours of what we will. But I think as you point out, the 8 hours of what we will is not just leisure time. 8 hours of what we will is often the time of care, or the time of the work of care, and forms of work of reproductive labor.
So there's this really beautiful contrast between the still interior scenes that you take and the shaky kind of handheld shots of the exterior that you take from your apartment. Was this a conscious choice? Because for me, it really kind of expresses this idea of the home being a space of safety and stillness, in contrast to the chaos or the uncertainty of the outside world.
During the first week of lockdown, the number of people who had died at the hands of the police and military on the streets enforcing lockdown was the same as the number of deaths from the virus. Now I think there's been 12 people who have been murdered by the police and the military. And so when I first started to see the sort of glimpses of violence outside on the street and hear the shouts and the sirens, I started to keep my camera out ready. I wanted to try and capture what was going on. I was always too late. I never quite got to capture on film the evidence of the violence. Sometimes only like the aftermath of the harassment or arrests, or in some cases beatings that were happening outside on my street. I think knowing what is going on, and then also knowing that I had this kind of feeling of that I wanted the state to take care of me, to look after me, to guide us through this period of the virus was a kind of very difficult experience, and I felt a kind of sense of shame about what I wanted from the state. I think I'm very lucky. I have a space that's safe, and I wasn't affected at all by the violence of the lockdown. But at the same time, the kind of hearing those sounds, trying to capture what's happening on the streets, way of that kind of entering into the space of the home. And I think for me, it also speaks to the way that the presence of the state is felt so strongly in our homes right now. The way we act, the way we think about interacting with others, our sense of safety, of security in relation to the virus is very much linked to the presence of the state. And so I think I wanted to somehow capture that relationship between the monotony of the days during the hard lockdown and the reality of the violence outside.
This is the final question. It really seems that we are more concerned with creating concessions within the current capitalist labor structure, within this 9 to 5, than thinking of alternative models that can replace the structure and are more conducive to a care-centered life practice. Do you think that art offers any new models towards alternative life work practices, or does it only offer critique?
I think it's important to think about, as artists or as people in the art world, what this means at this time for artists, and how this is affecting us. The reality is that most artists don't make their money from sales and exhibitions. We mostly have to find other jobs and work, and that's how we survive and make art. But I think also in that space, without suggesting that people should not be paid for their work. No one should have to work for free, but in that space there's also a lot of thinking around different kinds of structures, thinking like project spaces and collaboratives and things like that are really trying to work outside of the market and think about a different kind of art world. In a kind of broader perspective, South Africa has incredibly high unemployment, and many people will never experience wage labor or have some sort of secure permanent job. And I think in that context, the discussions around a citizen's wage are really important. And although the art world might seem very far away from that, the discussion around the citizen wage might also be a way to think about how to change the art world, or who can access the art world, who is in a privileged enough position to be able to survive the precarity that comes with being an artist. So I think that those conversations are linked, even if in some ways those worlds seem very far apart.
Hi Simon, my name is Lorena Wolfer. I am an artist and an activist working in Mexico City, and I'm excited to be part of this exchange organized by MOAC. So since the beginning of confinement, I've been working on this project called Desde Casa, from home, gathering, collecting the stories and experiences of women during confinement and lockdown through videos, stories, just like them narrating what they have experienced. And a lot of my work revolves around testimonies and storytelling, so I really appreciated your video. And I don't really have questions, rather I just kind of have responses to what I heard from you. I can relate and I can understand this strange feeling of nationalism that you describe and this need to go home. I've felt that during other moments where there's a certain urgency or emergency happening, and so I can relate to that. And then in response to your describing being alone and only being in charge of taking care of yourself, I can't help but think of how that experience is so different for women. And for us, it means multiplying our tasks and our responsibilities by 1,000 times, and making our lives even more complicated and even more just filled with endless work. So I do find myself kind of comparing what this means for women and for men. I've been talking a lot about the different impact that COVID-19 and the pandemic in general and lockdown has for women. That's what this project that I was talking about earlier is all about. So it's a big contrast with what you describe, and I don't know, I was also very moved by hearing people screaming and celebrating the news that they were going to be let out. And here in Mexico City, we were supposed to kind of like slowly go out next week in a partial deconfinement. And the head of government just announced that that's not happening. We are at the peak of the pandemic, and yet the streets in downtown Mexico where I live are more crowded and more loud than they've been in weeks. So here people are already out, and more and more cases are piling up. So anyways, these are my thoughts. Thanks so much. All my best.
Hi Lorena, thank you for your comments. I mean, I think your project to collect the stories of the experiences of women during this time sounds really important. I really believe that we need to share our experiences in this moment. But as you say, the effects of the lockdown are gendered, and I want to add in the Staffan context that they're racialized as well. And I think that, I know that, from speaking to friends of mine, that women, particularly women with families and children, in this time are finding it hard to work, and certainly finding it hard to find time to make work or to be able to share and reflect on those circumstances. So I think there's a real value in what you're doing. I've been thinking a lot around the relationship between capitalism and unemployment here, and that for a lot of women to enter into the workforce, that a lot of that work of care has to be outsourced. But not just to the state through the schools and so on, but work like domestic work or cleaners or people looking after children or people in the food industry and so on. Those jobs are often taken by women of color, and often those women have their own families that they need to look after. And that work is then taken on by someone else within the family, whether it's a mother or a sister or a daughter, who then has to take on that care work without being paid. The system really relies on gendered and racialized unemployment to maintain itself. I think in relation to that joy of the celebration, it was really amazing, and it really affected me, and really was a very special moment. Here we have a system of lockdown where there are 5 different levels, with 5 being the hardest level of lockdown, which is almost complete lockdown. What that announcement was for was the move to level 4, where there were small changes, but I think although many people who were cheering about that change would not really be affected in a huge way, maybe some people that meant that they would be able to work to earn income, which is important, but there's also a lot of the people that change was not going to be very big, and so it was very kind of moving to hear people feeling such a sense of joy. I think that sense of something changing was really important. I mean, what's interesting is that we moved to level 3 recently, and that's been a much bigger change. A lot more industries are working again. It's definitely possible for many more people now to go back into work. But at the same time, when that was announced, there was no cheering. There was no kind of similar moment of joy, and I think that speaks to maybe that now the sense that this is going to be a long, hard struggle has really hit home in a really hard way.
Hi Simon, this is Nilika Jawardana, and I have a question about how at the opening of the film, the narrator, who we do not yet see, tells the audience that he hasn't ever been particularly patriotic, but when he's faced with the prospect of being quarantined in transit and not being able to return once South Africa's airports will not allow anyone to disembark after a certain date, he wishes to, he says, return to the care of the state. That struck me as a pivotal statement. Later, when we see several instances of the state's violence towards its subjects, or given the neighborhood in which the narrator lives, immigrants from other parts of Africa who live and trade on the street along pavements and on shop fronts, which many South Africans don't see as legitimate subjects. The police then patrol the area, and the threat of their presence is always there. But the apparatuses of the state show profound uncare. At one point, we see the police take away trays of vegetables and fruit in vans. We see the state loots and terrorizes. But the narrator doesn't tell us anything explicitly about the dissonance between his initial instinct to return to care, to be homed and be given refuge in a time of uncertainty, and what subsequently unfolds below in the street surrounding his building. Given the specifics of the dynamic between the state, police, and the ever-present threat of violence towards, quote, migrants in South Africa who live and trade in that neighborhood, I wondered how audiences who don't necessarily know these details will read what's unfolding before them. And I'm also interested in the choices that you made in making something explicit but not others, and what that achieves in the film. And I wondered if you could speak about the dissonances, that statement about the return to care, and then showing the dissonance through a series of examples without verbalizing anything. Thanks.
Hi Nilika, thank you for the question. I think I want to speak really about the issue of my choices around the representation of the violence. But I think this was something that was quite important to me, and I thought about it a lot. I live in a fairly majority black and working class neighborhood, which also includes a lot of immigrants from the rest of Africa. And although apartheid ended 26 years ago, white people who are a very small minority here still hold most of the wealth and power. And the police force here, although it's a largely black, as an institution, it still reflects its history of apartheid. And I think that, black people are far more likely to suffer at the hands of the police, and especially immigrants from Africa. We have a real problem with xenophobia here. And there's a continuous police harassment, particularly of the street traders, many of whom are migrants from the rest of Africa. And they often suffer at the hands of the police. And when the government allowed them to come back onto the streets, I did see a few times that the police came through to confiscate their goods. Often these migrants are illegal; they don't have papers, so they're very vulnerable to the experience of police harassment. This is just one of the forms of police harassment that was happening during the lockdown. In the first draft of the film, I was much more explicit about the violence in talking about it. However, when I watched it back, I felt that it felt a little problematic. In South Africa, there's a long history of white South African artists trying to represent the voices and experiences of Black people. And I felt that as I'm not someone who's directly necessarily vulnerable to that violence, I needed to be very careful around the representation of it. I reduced the text down to a much smaller amount in the voiceover, but the images really punctuate the film, and I think that it was important for me to be able to I think through the images articulate, and I think they do this a lot better than I could do in the text, they articulate what's going on outside, but also speak to the distance at which I'm watching what's happening from, and speak to my positionality in relation to that.